Robyn Lacy, and I am a first-year PhD student at Lindenwood University of Newfoundland, doing archaeology, which is what my master's and undergrads are in. And most of my research centers around studying death and burial. Woodland is a very large cemetery in London, Ontario. It was opened in the 1860s after the city had decided that burials couldn't happen within city limits. It's in the city now, but from like spread and everything. But so it's owned by the Anglican Church, I believe, but it's like a non-denominational cemetery. So they originally had a graveyard attached to their cathedral in the center of town. And then when that got too full, or they decided they didn't want to bury people in the middle of town, which was like a thing that happened in the 19th century. Everyone's like, corpses can't be near the houses, we gotta move them. So then they started another burial ground, but there's a casino there now. They had to move it, and they didn't really move everyone, and they keep finding bodies. They moved everyone to Woodland, which was out of town at that point. It's still an active cemetery, but it's like half historic because it is almost 200 years old. And then it's half still an operating cemetery with quite a large area that they can still expand into. So when I worked there, I was a gravestone conservator, and there was another gravestone conservator on staff, and then 2 historians. So I fix old gravestones, basically, using stone conservation techniques that are very similar to how people restore old buildings. Very as low invasive as possible. We want things to be able to be reversible if they can be, do as little damage. It's a part of historic archaeology, which is my actual field. But through researching historic sites all the time, I'm really interested in industrial lime production, which is a niche little corner, and lime kilns and stuff, and what historic buildings use to preserve the stones. Instead of using concrete between bricks, you use lime mortar, which draws moisture out of the stone rather than keeping it trapped inside, so the mortar crumbles and the stones don't. If you see an old wall that looks like that, but the mortar is still there, it's concrete. And it's really bad, but that's a technique that is used for repairing historic gravestones as well, for the same reasons. So I was reading a lot about it, but hadn't done it practically, and then got this opportunity to work at Woodland and get training, which is super hard to find. So I only worked at Woodland Cemetery in 2019. So I wasn't working there when COVID really started happening, but people I knew were still working there, so I was still hearing about stuff, and I thought it was really a big step of them to have closed the gates to the public as early as they did, and a lot of other cemeteries in Ontario were doing the same thing, and that probably was a really hard decision to make, because of course this such a tough time. People are going to be grieving potentially more, or there's a lot more deaths happening, and to cut off the access to those burial spaces for everyone's protection and for the protection of the staff was probably a really tough decision to make, but I think ultimately a very good one. In Newfoundland now. When I wrote that piece, I was living in Ontario, but I had moved back and forth a couple times. So it's a very like any island community. It's a contained population. So if there's an outbreak in a contained area, or in an isolated area, it could be a lot more devastating than in a place where people are moving around a lot more. So what happened was somebody came into the province for a funeral, didn't know they had COVID. And then it spread from the funeral party, basically, and they had to go into a lockdown. I wasn't here at the time, but friends of mine were we had no cases, and then we suddenly had a whole bunch of cases. And it did get contained pretty quickly. I heard that Newfoundland had a pretty normal summer last year, which was amazing, because Ontario and everywhere else was in lockdown. I know that, of course, people were upset that the cemeteries were closed. There were some large sites in Toronto, Mount Pleasant, I think I mentioned in the article as well, that had shut its gates for a time. I hope that people understood that it was for safety and their own safety as well. But of course, if you can't access the site where your loved ones are buried, or you can't have as many people at the funeral of your grandmother, that's something that's really difficult, especially in a pandemic. So completely understand that people are upset. Or were upset because everything's opened again. But limiting numbers is just for the good of everyone, as difficult as it is. In Newfoundland, we had an outbreak in February due to like travel and community spread, and it went from like 1 case in the whole province to like 500 over the course of a week. So we were in lockdown, very, very strict lockdown for about 6 weeks, and now we're back to like under 30 cases in the province. Ontario is currently calling for the Premier to resign. So because of the way that they've been handling the entire pandemic, and reopening large businesses, but not allowing small businesses to open, which is like not helping the economy very much. Newfoundland has been lovely. Yeah, I think Newfoundland's doing a very good job. Like, our vaccine rollout is way slower than in the States, which is very frustrating. It's like we don't have that many cases overall, like in comparison, but we also don't have as many people. So, like I know like 3 people near me that have got their first shot, and that's about it. Like, my parents live in British Columbia, and they've just opened it up to people that are like 55 and older. Yeah, and like they also just admitted that like social workers should be getting vaccines who like go into homes to help people. I think that's the biggest issue right now, is that our vaccine rollout isn't being like, I'm sure it's being taken seriously, but it's not happening as quickly as it should be compared to other countries. I mean, that article was over a year ago now, so there's definitely some data in it that has been updated, and like the calls cluster was a big problem for Newfoundland, but it was taken under control quite quickly, and it hadn't been when I was writing that. It was like still this thing that everyone was freaking out about. Mm-hmm. But since then, the province has really like gotten on top of controlling the spread quite quickly. Which I don't think, like, when I reread the article, I was just like, this makes Newfoundland look really bad because it was happening at the time, but now this is like one of the safest places in Canada to be. Like, I had dinner last night in a restaurant because there's no cases here, so. The main thing is that quite a lot of stuff looks different on like the COVID landscape today, but there are still restrictions, of course, and there's still restrictions with like funerals, but the cemeteries are open to go to, which is nice.